I hate army painting. The sheer thought of painting the same miniature 100 times makes me fall into madness. And even though I would much rather paint a single display piece, I still want a fully painted army. Just without the suffering. So welcome to I Hate Army Painting, the series where I go through the torture of finding the best way to paint my Warhammer for your entertainment. Last time we painted these 5 swooping hawks using slap chop, which basically means dry brushing a light color over black and then slapping on contrast paints. But today I wanna try something different. Instead of using dry brushing, I'm willing to bet my ass cheeks that using a spray can or an airbrush for the light layer is gonna look way better. So let's find out if that's true and which one of these two is the winner. But before that, we still gotta assemble these guys. But luckily, I don't have to do that. Miniature assembly should be relaxing. A calming activity. An absolute pleasure for your soul.
I finally got it.
Well done, you freak. Well, the models are assembled. Let's do this. And the first thing I have to do is prime these guys, for which I use a spray can. Right away, it's clear I mastered this movement. Because I'm priming a lot, you perf! But also I'm a gooner. But anyway, I wanna simulate the same conditions for someone who doesn't have an airbrush. So while I could spray my minis inside, anyone can do what I do here. Now, here's the difference. 5 of these guys are sprayed with another lighter primer from the top, and the other 5 will get the airbrush treatment. Essentially, if you remember my slap chop video, this is the substitute for the dry brushing part. This has some upsides and some downsides. Obviously, it's way faster than dry brushing, and theoretically should result in smoother finish. But that's the thing. Only theoretically. Turns out, spray cans don't always have the same pressure, and if you use them for a zenithal highlight, you'll get a grainy finish. This depends on what kind of primer you use, how much of it is left in the spray can, but still, the fact that you can't control pressure is annoying. On the other hand, using airbrush is way better. It's way more accurate, you can actually decide which parts you wanna pick out and which ones you wanna leave darker. And because you control pressure, you don't get that grainy finish. That makes the process way more convenient and intentional, yet still much faster than dry brushing. Using slap chop, you will increase the pressure you apply on your brush when painting the head of the miniature or anything you wanna highlight more. And I'm kinda doing the same thing here, it's just that I have to press my trigger for longer or apply multiple passes. It's like magic. There is one big downside, however. You have to own an airbrush, which, you know, is less than 2 boxes of Space Marines, so very expensive. Anyway, looking at the primed models, the spray can batch looks pretty rough. The surface has this uneven, grainy finish, and I couldn't be selective about which parts I wanna highlight more or less. Mind you, the surface is not grainy on touch. It's actually pretty smooth. It's just that the paint is not dispersed properly. This could be fixed with a better spray can that still has a lot of paint and pressure in it. But you still couldn't pick out which parts will be lighter. Compare it to the airbrushed batch and holy shit. These guys are crisp. The paint has much better dispersion, they are much smoother, and you can clearly see that some parts are lighter than the rest. For example, the knee pads or the fronts of their helmets are way lighter, and it's this kind of contrast that'll help us going forward. In a side-by-side comparison, I am pretty sure which one I would choose. So if this was slap chop, that would conclude the slap part. And now we have to chop and apply the contrast paint. For the most part, this is the same as in the previous video, but by the end you'll see it has some interesting consequences. Just like last time, I prepared my own mix of contrast paints, so by combining various yellows and reds, I get something I am happy to work with. There is one particular contrast paint which was pretty much made for fire dragons. But I know your tricks, GW. So remember that you don't have to buy every paint in the existence, just mix them yourself. Even here, applying contrast paints on top of my minis was strangely satisfying, almost addicting in a way. I really like how it pulls in various spots and gravity takes care of the rest. Of course, guiding the paint with my brush would give me quote-unquote better result. But I don't know, I kinda dig it. At times I was so lost in the sauce I kinda forgot that mini painting is about precision. So some spots were covered with this orange, even though they shouldn't be. In my mind I justified it by telling myself that I'll cover it with darker colors anyway. Which is true, but you know, it's just being sloppy. Aside from this little problem, I realized that the orange is not strong enough to have a proper coverage. So instead of using the same mix as before, Gryph-hound Orange came to the rescue. Maybe I should have used this particular color from the start, but after another coat on the armor, these boys looked way more juicy. Next in line were the helmet. I've pretty much chosen to paint them with the box art color scheme in mind, so yellow was the obvious choice. So I took one of the fire dragons and spread that shit all over his face. Super satisfying.
Yeah, boy.
This was especially true for the airbrushed fire dragons. If you don't know how to distinguish them from each other, just look at the base and you'll see it's way darker for the airbrushed ones. And when it came to the other batch, the ones which had a zenithal highlight with a spray can, it was still satisfying, but with a caveat. When you look at the side of this helmet, the grainy surface is still visible, and the contrast layer didn't make a dent. Before going further, there were still some details we had to go over. The fabric was super easy, and just one coat of this red contrast paint was fine. And honestly, if I left it just like this, it would be enough. But you know, I'm not gonna stop there. Before doing some refinement on these guys to really push them further, there were two more things. First of all, I had to cover the small golden bits and leather straps. And then the weapons. However, this is completely useless and I'll have to paint over them anyway. You see, the small details are the bane of any speed painting method. And you either accept the fact that you won't paint them properly, or you bite the bullet and paint them well. Which obviously takes more of your precious time. Just like the last time, I mixed my own dark contrast paint mix for the weapons. Unfortunately, not only was I not happy with that particular shade, but also the staining from my messy painting was showing through. So that means I have to mask it with more passes and I'll have to fix it in the next stage. As much as this was supposed to be the satisfying stage, it didn't really go the way I wanted. Actually, it doesn't look that bad, but I just hate the fact you can see some orange on those weapons. And even here, when you compare these two batches, I prefer the airbrushed ones, because they have better contrast and their helmets are not grainy at all. Either way, I reloaded my wet palette and it was time to make up for my sloppy f***up. But let's be honest here, I will do this step anyway. And perhaps the most important part is the face. In this case, helmet. Whenever you look at anyone, this is the first thing you care about, so it's no wonder this is the focal point of every miniature. Even if I did use a contrast paint to darken the face mask, there is no way I could paint the eye lenses like that. So once it was time to do that, I did it the old-fashioned way and layered it. If by a chance I spilled a bit of black on the yellow parts, I could easily fix it with a few edge highlights. And just like that, the face stands out even more. On a single model this doesn't take extremely long, but multiply it 10 times and it makes for a hefty time investment. If you are mostly into gaming part of this hobby rather than painting, maybe you think I could skip this step and not paint lenses at all. This is true, however, when I started with Warhammer, I was captured by the beautiful models it had. It wasn't the rules or the lore, it was the aesthetics. So of course I care about what my minis look like. Many people complain about the rules of the game and about balance issues, and it makes sense. If you wanted the most competitive game, you would play something like chess, not Warhammer. So in my opinion, the aesthetics is really what makes Warhammer work, not the rules. But hey, maybe that's just me. Aside from the eye lenses, there were other parts that couldn't be possibly painted with one coat of contrast paint. This goes for the small golden details and gemstones. It'll sound super dumb, but I used non-metallic metal instead of metallics. Okay, listen, I know it takes longer, but not that much longer. This process took like extra 10 to 20 minutes per miniature, and for me, it's worth it. Because keep in mind, once these guys are painted, they are painted forever. If you are a big fan of metallic paints, don't worry, we'll use them in the future for a very specific painting method. However, today is not that day. After painting those small details, it was time to tackle armor and weapons. Since armor is like 90% done, a little bit of cleanup and adding some edge highlights here and there is a fine solution. I mostly do this for the upper side of the model, because that's the important part.
Give it to me.
For the weapons, metallics and all the dark parts, I use the same color as for my swooping hawks. It's always a nice touch to use some common elements across your army, even if the units are so much different. So aside from the bases, that's exactly what I do. In a side-by-side comparison, there isn't a huge difference. But it is there. Looking at the airbrushed fire dragons, they have more contrast, because I selectively highlighted certain spots. Also, they are much smoother than the other badge. If you indeed look at the helmets of the other badge as well as some other parts, the grainy finish is still there, but it's not too bad. Overall, these guys are more bright, but also more flat, because the zenithal highlight didn't create that nice shading. If I had to choose between these two, airbrush wins. No doubt about that. But now you truly see that it didn't matter as much, because we used the same techniques once they were primed. However, here comes the shocking part. Are these approaches better than slap chop? So let's look at the slap chopped swooping hawks again and compare them to the airbrushed fire dragons. And I gotta say, I probably like these two squads equally. The swooping hawks have a really nice shading and contrast, which is visually pleasing, but they do have that rough texture. Fire dragons are much smoother, more refined, and still do have some shading, but not as much. So in terms of quality, I would rank them equally. But here's the kicker. To paint that nice shading on swooping hawks took me way longer than airbrushing it. So all in all, I will rate the airbrushed fire dragons with 6 beards out of 10, slap chop plus highlight with 5 beards out of 10, and using zenithal highlight at 4 beards. When it comes to progress of my army, now we have 3 different units painted, and I'll count in this dope Maugan Ra I painted a few years ago, which puts us at around 20% of 2000 point army. And since now we've unlocked airbrush in this army painting series, at some point I wanna test a method, which will be so much faster and so much better that you'll literally shit yourself. But until then, you should definitely watch this video, where I try slap chop for the first time in my life. And trust me, it's worth it. And see you there.